And so welcome to Active Travel Cafe for the 6th of February 2024. Tonight we're joined by Rachel Tripp from Newham in London. We'll be talking about low traffic neighbourhoods and campaigning for them. Thank you very much, Rachel, for coming along. But as ever, we'll start with news, and we'll dive straight into the news. And who is first up with news? I'm pretty sure we're going to have some LTN related news content as well this week. Adam, you were straight in there with your piece of news.
So Bath and North East Somerset, they basically announced single member decisions to make 3 of the LTN trials permanent. One of the trials has been called in. To me, it comes across as being kind of a political game rather than friendly. But anyway, that aside, and they also then announced what they're calling 5 new LTNs, but effectively turns out to be what I'd call 3 LTN cells plus a scheme to make it much better for drivers to drop their kids off at school. So there's some concerns about one of them, but I think in general it's a really positive move that they seem to be pushing forward against this. One of the new trials that they're proposing, they've decided to put the TROs through or committed to do them. And I think there's an online petition that's already at 3,500, if not more, against it already, which is I think quite typical sometimes. Yeah, that's it from Bath and North East Somerset.
Okay, thanks very much. So let's go up the country a little bit north to Worcester. Not that far from Bath. Dan in Worcester.
Hello. Minor active travel news, but we're getting a pump track in Worcester in the city. I think the budget was set about 2.5 years ago for that. There's been a bit of design work and then a fairly substantial consultation, bit of local opposition. But the meeting last week, the officers actually proposed to defer it and have another think. What was brilliant was there was cross-party support politically from the 4 main parties to not do that and to just crack on and build it, which is probably politically quite brave, and also look at other sites for an additional pump track. So really, really very positive news from Worcester. We take what we can get.
Great. And let's go to A. Kelly. I'm not quite sure where you're from.
Hi there, yeah, Andy Kelly. I'm in Wiltshire.
Okay.
So yeah, I'll start with some local news. So very local actually to me. We had some traffic counters on the street that I live on put in before Christmas. Results from that are in. It's a 20-mile-an-hour street, and essentially there's a lot. The majority of people going along there are rat running and speeding. So I'm actually going to attend a parish council meeting tonight where they're talking about putting in some modal filters at the end of the street to turn it into a low traffic neighbourhood. So very interested in what Rachel's got to say today. Very timely, very pertinent. I'm hoping it is Wiltshire. Wiltshire's not really renowned, I think, for being particularly active travel friendly, but I'm hoping that we can get some movement on that. And then slightly further afield, some of you have probably seen in the news that Paris has just introduced or is planning to introduce some quite hefty charges for SUVs, defining those at any vehicle over 1.6 tons. I did actually hear quite a good phone in yesterday on James O'Brien on LBC at 11 o'clock. If anyone's interested, it was very, very good. One of his questions, he was getting people to ring in who drive SUVs to ask them if they realised how selfish they're being, which I thought was really good. But apologies to anyone who drives an SUV. But yeah, that's all my news this week.
Okay, terrific. And so we obviously had a quite successful LTN campaign in Oxford, and I will drop into the chat a bit later a link to some of the resources we created out of that. There's a kind of campaigner's guide and timeline, and a leaflet we created for residents. So anyway, watch the chat a bit later, a link to a COSAT website with some resources that might be helpful for you will appear. But I'm
Fantastic.
busy.
Thank you.
I'm busy introducing people right now. So I'll introduce Sally from Newcastle, whose LTN story will not be quite as cheerful.
Terrible news, Newcastle. So Newcastle started developing a citywide programme of LTNs just before COVID. And in 2021, published that policy. And round about this time last year, put in a number of, actually no, it started the year before, I think, putting in low traffic neighbourhoods in Heaton and in Fenham. About this time last year, one went into Jesmond. All of these are neighbourhoods quite close to the city centre. Jesmond's right next to the city centre. And it was a huge low traffic neighbourhood. I think probably a couple of miles by maybe half a mile, something like that. And so the experimental order is due to run out in September, and it's just been taken out. And I guess this is sort of the kind of, it doesn't really matter what you do to support things if people keep changing. So I've worked out that in the time that since this policy was developed, actually no, since 2021, we've had 2 leaders of the council, 4 cabinet members with responsibility for transport. Half of the local councillors in the neighbourhood have changed since it was first announced. We've had 2 directors of transport, and we've had 2 principal transport planners who've been responsible for the scheme. So it's really, really frustrating for us. But essentially, we think this has come right from the top. Nick Kemp, who's the relatively new leader of the council, since May 2022. We think this is where it's come from. He wants these things out. So I think that's so difficult, isn't it? Just when you feel like you've got things into a really good place, and unfortunately the 2 most senior staff in the transport team leave to go to Active Travel England. How dare they? It all falls apart. So we're all kind of very depressed here, and hoping that Heaton stays in, because Heaton, the experimental order is due to run out at the end of April. So we need confirmation that's going to stay in the next few weeks before the pre-election period starts.
Good luck, Sally, with that one remaining one. Okay, Bob.
Super quick, because I was going to mention both those things, but just on the SUV thing, I think we have to tread quite carefully here, because there's quite a wave of opposition developing, and we have to target it quite carefully. So we don't just have a kind of lightning conductor of SUVs, and we're aware of all cars, whether they're EVs or whatever. That's also that only 5% of the Parisian public actually voted for it, and also residents are exempt. But so have to approach it a bit gingerly, I think.
Yes, I think that's a very important point that is often missed in some of the coverage. It's that it's only applied to visitors. And it's not strictly SUVs either, it's vehicles above 1.6 tonnes, or 2 tonnes if they're electric. Okay, Sarah from Farnborough and Aldershot.
Right. Hi, I just wanted to say that our Cycling UK funded Big Bike Revival project, intervention, whatever you want to call it, is finished, and it involved learn to fix and ride sessions. And it was hugely well received. A member of Cycling UK came to one of the Learn to Fix events, which were the most popular. Learn to Fix was more popular than going out for a bike ride. And I just want to encourage people to use this initiative, because it just gets everyday people coming along. I can share some Instagram posts with you if you want, of the Learn to Fix sessions, if I can work out how to do that. That's from me.
Great, that's really terrific. I mean, although I live in a market town of 35,000 people, we have a group of about 3 or 4 people who do a monthly Dr. Bike session at the market hall in the market square, basically. and that is invariably popular. There's usually a queue of people there with their rusty old bikes trying to get them fixed. So it is a great way of building community relationships. H, what do you have for us this week? No? Is that a mute problem? I can't see you haven't got video on, so I can't see if your mouth is moving, but your microphone is off. You're muted.
Okay.
No. I'll just stall for a while by talking about...
always post something in the chat when it's able to.
Yeah. So a couple of things, if you haven't seen it yet, the National Travel Attitudes Study Wave 9, which I think was mentioned in brief last time, is it's a survey run by the Department for Transport. This wave, it covered cycling, electric vehicles and local bus travel. There's some interesting insights on all of those. I think the interesting one on cycling, it basically said in an average week, 30% of people cycle, 70% don't, which is quite an interesting number, although I'd probably trust the National Travel Survey a bit more than I trust this survey. What was really interesting is it asked, one of the questions is essentially, have you ever cycled? And only 7% of adults had never cycled. So by calculation, 93% of people have been able to cycle at some point in their lives. So most people can, of course, some of them may not be able to cycle now, but essentially a great majority of people can cycle. And there's a British Heart Foundation survey of a few years ago that showed that 87% of people can know how to cycle, which is much more than the 75% of people who know, adults who know how to drive. So more people know how to cycle than know how to drive, which is useful to know at times. And the other thing from Oxfordshire is we had a pretty brutal January with 8 people killed on the roads, which is astonishing, where our normal average annual death toll on the roads is 25 over the last 10 years on average. And the police have not been prioritising road safety, so we and the county council who are very much on side have been calling for more police action. We've also the county council have also just launched their Vision Zero strategy, which they've been working on for some time, which is pretty good, although it does have a gap where it should have better enforcement, which is presumably because the police haven't been as involved as we would all like them to be. So we're generally going to be pointing that out, but otherwise supporting the strategy. And of course, we have I don't know how many of you also have this, but we have a police and crime commissioner election coming up in May. The 2 rivals to the current candidate, to the current incumbent, have both said they are going to put road safety, road danger reduction, I should call it here, as a much higher priority. So the PCC elections might be a thing to keep an eye on between now and May, and do some campaigning around. Will, what have you?
Hello there.
Have a piece for us?
Yeah, Adam Pipe is the Essex County Council Road Safety Officer, and he attended one of our Cultures to Cycling campaign meetings recently. One of the figures he came up with for the increase in road accidents is 1 in 3 of every serious incident or fatality now includes a drug driver. So wow, that's that we need to look at. The video is, the whole meeting is on camera. It's recorded, so we can. I'll pop the link into the chat when I can find it. But that was one of the big facts that came out of it. And I was editing a story for the Irish paper at the weekend, the Irish paper that I work for, and they haven't yet caught up with the drug driving things yet. So kind of they were blaming drink driving. And I said, look, haven't you got any drug driving figures? And they said, oh, no, we've not really been collecting the data until about the last 8 to 10 months. So I think they're going to have a shock when all this comes in. The other thing, just totally unrelated, is I've put in an FOI to Essex County Council just out of interest to see how much money they reclaim from drivers' insurances for damage to street furniture, railings and things like that. Because if they're not claiming it from drivers and they're not claiming it from the Motor Insurance Bureau, which is for uninsured drivers, who the hell is paying it? And the answer is the taxpayer, you and me. So that's another way, if that's the case, that drivers are being subsidised.
Right. That's really interesting, Will. I'd be really interested to see that video. And the other thing that was published actually in November was essentially going back over the Stats 19 data for 2021 and updating the figures after full investigations are done, and changing the essentially updating the figures, which found that the cause was somewhat different, and actually speeding was more of a factor than previously thought. And I'll pop that link in the chat because that's quite interesting reading as well. H, do you have your?
Yeah, it's
you're on sound again now.
It's this damned Android.
It's really quick.
Oh, we've got echoes now.
We're running out of time. Yeah, Rachel.
Okay. Quick one. Will's on drug drivers. We've also had a little exchange with a fun survey done of people who have vanity plates and the amount of time they crop up in RTCs, in illegal parking. And someone's done some psychiatric analysis of people who drive vehicles with vanity plates and particular types of vehicle, which is having some rather interesting results. I wonder if anything more serious has been done in that respect, so we can actually profile the type of drivers. Because I know that some of the fatal HGV cyclist crashes have involved vanity plate HGVs, with the company name. And whether that's sort of an indicator which can help us find the way on that. And I'm also checking out the bus crash at Victoria, which is the second fatality at Victoria bus station in 3 years. And whether the person was on the apron or whether they were on the bus island, it's not very clear.
And there'll be some really interesting analysis to do. I mean, I wish the government would crack on with its road investigation branch that it promised 2 years ago.
Yeah.
Right, let us move on because we're a couple of minutes late, but that was a good news session. So we'll move on to back to the topic of LTNs, and Rachel from Newham in East London, which for geographical purposes stretches from Stratford to London City Airport, roughly. So you have a cable car in your southern corner, which is fantastic. Rachel, do you want to kick off from there?
Sure, very happily. Hello, my name's Rachel. As has just kindly been said, I'm really pleased to be here. I'm a councillor for Forest Gate North Ward, which is tucked right up at the top of Newham, which, as has been said, spreads across part of East London. An incredibly diverse ward, an incredibly diverse borough. And I think it's a really interesting place to be because I think that the centre of London is kind of shifting east. And I have a bit of a hobby horse that part of what I think we're dealing with in Newham is a kind of change in transport terms as people change from a kind of outer London mentality to a sort of inner London approach to transport. And there's a kind of hump for us to get over there, I think. I'm just going to share my screen and talk a little bit about my experience of trying to campaign for and support LTNs in Newham. Share my screen. Beginning. Okay, are you able to see that there?
Not yet, but we're ever hopeful. It worked in the test, but sometimes it takes a second.
Ago, it? Okay, let's have another go. Here we go.
Yes, share. Here it comes.
Okay, brilliant.
Yep.
From the beginning. Right, let's try and do full screen. How's that?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, so that's me. I've specified a view from the back benches, and I'll come to that. I'm not asking you to get out the world's smallest violin at this point, but I did just want to start to say it is a funny old job being a councillor. Sometimes people ask me why I do it. I'm never quite sure how to answer. I think it's a kind of compulsion that you either have or you don't. There is there is a lot of scrutiny, and being scrutinized for what you do is entirely correct. But there is also a lot of abuse, and particularly I've seen over the last 9 years, that kind of level of abuse really increase. I have to say, I personally haven't really suffered with a lot of that, but a lot of my colleagues really have, and particularly women, and particularly women of colour, which I think is just really worth bearing in mind in this environment. Like who would put themselves forward? The scope of the role is absolutely enormous. You could absolutely do it full time or more than full time if you had the kind of the energy and the will. Local government just has no money. I don't have to explain to anyone here the absolutely crippling social inequality that engenders and the terrible things that happen. But also as a councillor, of course, having no money is just really boring. Nobody ever entered local politics in order to do what I sometimes say to my friends is my job, which is just to say no nicely. Like that's not a fun thing to do. It's part of my job. I do it. I'll take it on the chin. Being part of a political party has an awful lot of great stuff with it. I'm really proud of the heritage of my political party. It also carries with it a lot of difficulties. You know, collectivism is our greatest strength, but is also can be really, really hard. And I find, as someone who represents the ward that I live in, one of the things that I love, but that I also find hard, is the fact that I'm always on. My daughters laugh with me that I can't take more than 2 steps outside the house without someone saying, "Oh, Rachel, while you're here, can I just catch you and grab you to ask you this?" And again, that is, to a certain extent, that's quite right. And I walk the streets that I campaign on and cross the roads that I'm trying to make safer and make better. But it's also quite intense. So I think I wanted to start by saying it's really easy, and I have done this as well. It's easy to feel really frustrated with councillors for not doing the right thing. And like I say, I share that frustration, and I think councillors should be held up to high standards. But it's also campaigning for active travel, particularly campaigning for low traffic neighbourhoods, is really intense and can be really difficult. So I've already said, when people ask me why I became a councillor, sometimes I tell them I'm not really sure why. Sometimes I don't feel very sure why. People do come to it with a whole variety of different interests. You know, some local councillors are really not interested in active travel, and to a certain extent, if they have really active interests in other things, then actually fair enough. There are lots of areas of local government that actually I say to myself as a part-time backbencher, I say, well, actually, that is great, and I will be involved if a resident wants me to, and I will represent them. But as you can't do everything, it's not possible. But the biggest reason I think why people become a councillor is to make a difference. And so I suppose for me, one of the main kind of selling points of being involved in active travel is it is physical. You can go out, you can put your hand on it. It's lasting, it's discrete bits of infrastructure you can use. And I wanted to illustrate this point by showing these pictures, which show the before and after of the local Healthy Schools Street. This is my local infant school. All of my daughters have been there. When it was implemented, my 2 youngest, I think, were still there. And there was a literal incredible difference. And I still think that every morning when I walk my youngest to school, to the junior school around the corner, the road is quiet. There are people in the road. I saw 2 people cycling along next to each other, having a really furious conversation in Spanish with their children on the back of the bikes. Starting to see cargo bikes, which we never saw, you know, sort of 15 years ago when I moved to Forest Gate. It's made a really huge difference. And the healthy school streets, and I will come back to this later as well, I think are a really helpful thing to start to open people's eyes to how incredibly dominated our public space is by cars, and how it doesn't have to be that way, but it is hard, I think, for people to see it, and healthy school streets can help you to understand that. So apologies in advance, because I know a lot of this won't be incredibly new to you, but I just wanted to kind of put it through the kind of local councillor lens. I always think with low traffic neighbourhoods in particular, that there is a huge spectrum of opinion, and there are all the people sort of right over here who are incredibly passionate and massively for them, and basically kind of whatever happens, they will keep their opinions. And then there are people right on the other side who feel incredibly concerned about them, have a really often very intense kind of emotional reaction against any restrictions on their car use. And again, actually, you know, are those people going to change their minds? I would hope so, but possibly not. And then there's this kind of broad swathe of people in the middle. And it's really the people in the middle who I always think I'm most interested in talking to. And I've said here, sometimes you're aiming for mayor. And I really do mean that. I spoke to a woman on the doorstep and was talking to her about her road. And she said to me, oh, about those planters over there. She was literally about 4 doors away from a filter. She said, I didn't like them to begin with, but now I think they're okay. And that actually, I've kind of mentally recorded that conversation as like one of the kind of biggest wins that I feel like I've had with LTNs. She had obviously been really skeptical about them to begin with. She's never going to be outside campaigning to have them kept. She won't be an advocate for extending them. But if you ask her, she's like, yeah, it's okay. It's all right. And I think I'll take that. I think it's really important, and you guys will know this as well, to keep talking about walking. This is too short a session to go into now all the reasons why people on bikes seem to have become a particular target of whatever culture war is raging at the moment. But I find, talking about people walking, everybody walks, talking about walking on the roads that they live on, walking with their children, walking to go and see their friends, that really, really helps me to kind of keep the conversations open. And I also find there's something about not being too kind of religiously attached to LTNs as an approach. I think my approach with LTNs is I really want cleaner air and safer streets and increased community connections and thriving local businesses. And actually, LTNs are the best way that we know to achieve that at the moment. Who knows? 10 years' time, there might be another approach. And if there was, I like to think I would keep an open mind and listen to what that is. And I find bringing that kind of spirit, like this is the best evidence we've got at the moment, and it's imperfect, but it's an approach. We know it works, and this is what we're going to try. Keeping that spirit, I find, really helps to keep conversations really kind of open and collaborative. I've made the obvious point here that speaking to people on their doorsteps, not at meetings, is really, really helpful. I've rarely had a good conversation with people where you've called them together. It brings a kind of combative sort of air of rhetorical debate and winners and losers. Whereas actually, I have had some really good conversations with people of all different ideas and all different kind of standpoints, where I've actually been on their doorstep. And when I've been out door knocking, out with kind of local political leaflets, and then the idea about transport has come up. Those discussions have been really helpful. I think there's a point about when to step up and talk to people and when actually to step back. Some of the most useful discussions about low traffic neighbourhoods in particular, where there have been useful discussions online, some of those haven't been when I've stepped in and sort of started giving people chapter and verse about them. If I pause for a moment and allow other voices to come in, then sometimes those questions start to kind of resolve themselves. And I think it's tempting. I think it's tempting for everyone. Maybe it's particularly tempting for local councillors to try to sort of charge in and start correcting people. And actually, I think that urge isn't a helpful one. I've also said here the problem of evidence. Obviously, we do have a lot of evidence about low traffic neighbourhoods, but for whatever reason at the moment, that isn't massively compelling. And I always want it to be, but I always find that it isn't. So I find it helpful to have evidence kind of in my back pocket, if you like, but not to immediately rely on it. And I've already mentioned the idea about school streets, and I would say also play streets and temporary closures as a kind of entry-level way of getting people to understand the streets belong to us. They shouldn't be these kind of dangerous places. They're paid for by us. We own them. In many places, urban places, there are only public spaces. And so we should decide in a much more equitable way about what happens to them and who gets to travel along them and how safe they are while they do it. I've just done a couple of notes here relating some of the points I've already made. I think a really good conversation for me about an LTN would ideally be in person, but sometimes those do have to be online. I think it's really helpful to start with the specifics. It's really good to come with a detailed knowledge of the particular road that a person lives on, the road that their children go to school on, the road, then local high street. That is really helpful. I think it's also helpful to take those conversations from the specific out to London as a whole and start to talk, again, just very gently about ideas like that way that the numbers of cars have increased so much over the last 10 or 20 years, the way that modern transport policy is going all over the world, I think that can be really useful. Every place is unique, but no place is quite as unique as it thinks it is. I find it really, really helpful to give people a bit of space to express the frustrations that they have first. Some people are really, really worried, and sometimes those worries are disingenuous, but often they're not. And often they are the same as the worries that people express disingenuously. You know, access to people who are disabled, for example, is a real concern, but is also often used by well, I say often, also sometimes used by bad faith actors. So it's really, really important to hear those concerns, to understand how disabled people can move around low traffic neighborhoods, how we can make that easier, and a lot of the barriers that disabled people already face that might not have been considered in the way they should have been. Once I've done that kind of listening, once you've really heard it, repeat it back to the person what you've heard, so that they really know that you know where they're coming from. I find it helpful to gently introduce a bit of challenge. Say, well, of course, I see that. I know that people are concerned about the effect on boundary roads. And I often say, it is interesting, though, that where this approach has been taken in other places, that incredible impact on boundary roads, for example, massive congestion and disaster on the main roads, isn't necessarily what we see. Like, the evidence we have doesn't really show that that happens. And then leave a bit of space. And people may reject that, and they may say, well, that's what you say, but that's not actually the case. Yeah, fair enough. And leave a bit of space for consideration, both on my part of what they're saying, and on their part of what I'm bringing to them. And I wanted to finish here by saying it's a conversation, not a conversion, which I find really useful. And I think we all, like, I feel so passionate about the safety of people who are walking and cycling, and about the social justice aspects of it, and the way it relates to the climate emergency. But I also think, you know, here we are. We have to have conversations with people. People feel really strongly about where they live. And if we just kind of rush in with all the evidence, with a really firmly held point of view, without the space for people to talk to us, then actually it doesn't go as well as it could if we just have a little bit more caution. Obviously, I'm sure the emotional power of the car is something that you guys have spoken about a lot. I did read somewhere, and I wish I should try to find it, that car ownership was more closely correlated to the length of time that someone had lived in London than it was to other socioeconomic factors. And I found that interesting because it really tallied with my experience of speaking to people. I found that people who've lived in Newham a long time had a feeling about being able to park their car, about the number of cars a household could have, about access to the places they wanted to go, which is not necessarily held by people who've moved more recently. Cars obviously can be a really important part of people's identity. And also, I think for a lot of young people, it's really the only space that they can have that's their own. If you're never going to be able to buy your own house, if you're living with your parents really in the long term, but you're in a sort of relatively successful professional job, then actually you can buy yourself a nice car, and it is your own space in a way that other places just aren't. And I also wanted to mention the perceptions of safety. Now, we could debate how real they are, but there is a very firmly held feeling that, particularly among certain ethnic groups, but also, to be honest, you know, among a lot of white people as well as other ethnic groups, that women and children in particular are not safe walking and cycling, and that those people should be in cars, either because of danger from other cars or because of danger from crime, danger from assault. You know, this idea that in a car that one is safe. And I think if we're going to combat that, if we're going to make safe streets, we have to understand those feelings first. So I just wanted to finish by saying that it's easy to overestimate the power of a local councillor. I come across this a lot. People saying that people must go into local politics for the power and the money. And I kind of say, if that's what I wanted, I would probably do literally almost anything else. You know, you're not, as a local ward councillor, you're there to represent people. Nobody is waking up in the morning wondering how they feel about low traffic neighborhoods and thinking, oh, well, maybe I'll ask Rachel. Perhaps she has an idea that I could adopt as my own. I also often think, like, in the real world, muggles, if you will, real people, do they actually know who their councillors are? Like, I spent a lot of my life not knowing who my local councillors were. And I think that is very, very normal. Local councillors have really limited power, especially in the directly elected mayoral system that we have in Newham. So I think that's really important. But also, I think to end more positively, you have to not underestimate the things that you can do locally. We've got, or we should have, as ward councillors, really good detailed knowledge of local opinion formers. Goodness knows I don't necessarily like online debate, but if you asked me, I could name probably the 10 people who would almost certainly take part in any debate online about Forest Gate. And I probably got their numbers in my phone, and I could tell you how they would react probably to certain things. I've got good knowledge of the local businesses. I think, certainly from my point of view, being really steadfast in my support for active travel has to a certain extent insulated me from some of the backlash when we've made proposals. I think some people have gone out to try to change people's minds, try to change other councillors' minds, and have thought, well, there's no point trying to convince Rachel because she's very steadfastly for active travel. And so I think that has acted as a certain amount of protection. I think it's been really interesting for me to think about how the things that we do in my ward can then show the way forward for the rest of the borough. We had the first LTN in my ward. We had the first Healthy School Street. We had the first Play Street. And I did all of those things, not to show off about my ward or my work, but more to say, actually, we can have this here too. Like Newham might be a borough with an awful lot of challenge, but that doesn't mean that we can't have nice things. And actually, the things that happen in Forest Gate can happen right across the borough. I think what I try to do in my relationships with officers is to be really consistent and steadfast and not to be kind of rocked by the initial kind of feedback and concern you might get from people. And I hope, I'm sure the officers could tell you more reliably than me, but I hope that that really empowers officers to know that in my ward they can go ahead and do the right thing. And I hope also that gives some security to local campaigners to know that they have a group of voices within the council, including mine, but lots of others as well, who will be really steadfast in their support for active travel and in what we're trying to achieve. And I think that brings me to the end. There we go. I think you're on mute.
I am on mute, making the classic mistake. That was a really good run through from a different kind of very human, non-infrastructural perspective, although I think we've recognised a lot of things in there. And I've seen one question so far, and I wrote down a similar one, and I think that's a good one to start us off on. And I've got a couple others related to it. So actually, I'll start off with in the move towards LTNs in Newham specifically. Who started that move? Was it people? Was it the council? I mean, you describe yourself as a councillor and a campaigner. Was it people like you who were a bit of both?
I think it was a combination of things. We had a new administration, still Labour, but a new mayor. So that made a big difference. There was a space for officers who I think had had some ambition around active travel for a while that they felt previously might not have been possible or palatable. I think that there was, particularly in the north of the borough, a kind of rising sense from residents that, particularly because of our proximity to Waltham Forest, the sense that actually you only had to travel quite a short physical difference to be somewhere that had a very radically different approach to how people move around. And obviously you travel that short distance, you cross the borough boundary, but the actual kind of demographics and the makeup of the types of buildings and all the stuff that's there already is still the same. I was only for about 6 months the cabinet lead for highways, and in that point I went and met with Clyde Lokes from Waltham Forest, and we kind of dreamed up together with officers the idea about doing the first cross-borough LTN. So I do think that relationship, which I started, other people carried on and implemented. That was really important as well. So I think it was a combination of things.
Right. And then that kind of I mean, the Waltham Forest is interesting because that was one of the inspirations for us in Oxford as well. We arranged for councillors and officers to go to Waltham Forest as well as campaigners, and it was saw Clyde, and he came to Oxford. It was an inspiration. So the more general version of that, which Rachel I think asked, the other Rachel, was how to go from a general position of, I'll call it car acceptance, like there's always cars, there's loads of cars, that's completely normal, to we need to do something about this, we need to change this situation. If we could do that.
That's a $64,000 question.
Yes, it is, isn't it?
It's
worth much more than that.
I feel like for me, it's been an incremental approach, and there have been several important steps. I think for us as a London borough, implementing borough-wide parking restrictions was really hard to do, but was very important because that starts getting the idea that actually there is no automatic entitlement to put your private vehicle out on the road, and no automatic entitlement to park anywhere that you want for free. And that starts to introduce the idea that street space is a finite resource. I think similarly, moving to emissions-based parking and charging for all parking permits was the next kind of piece of that puzzle. And that was enormously controversial and very, very difficult to implement. And I don't envy at all my colleagues who were in charge of that when it happened. But it was so very, very obviously the right thing to do. So I think it is bit by bit. I think we have a lot of car-free developments now in Newham where residents can't have residence parking permits. Again, that's not uncontroversial, but it's a really important part of saying that to live in London, to move around, to get to and from the places you need to go, you don't have to have a car. And in some cases, you just can't because there isn't space to put it. But overall, I'd say I don't necessarily know the answer to that question. I'd love to.
Yes, I think that's if we all knew the answer to that, we'd be doing it. And a good question from Martin Lucas Smith, who's in Cambridge with the Cycle Streets team, which is a fantastic set of resources. So what's the best approach to deal with bad faith actors? So, for example, people who use the disabled as an excuse for not doing anything, and by which he clarifies not that we shouldn't take account of genuine disabled access issues, which are important, but the people who are using it as an excuse, not in a genuine way. And there are many other examples of people who are essentially coming up with excuses, non-factual approaches to try and delay or eliminate low traffic neighbourhoods and other schemes.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good question. Some of the heat around debates about disabled access, I find I can take out by focusing in really specifically on blue badges. And actually that does undermine some of the bad faith. If people say, oh, but you're saying everyone must cycle 10 miles a day and not everyone can, then coming back to that and saying, oh, of course, not everyone can cycle, although some people do use their bikes as mobility aids, but people who really are unable to walk short distances will have free parking available in blue badge provision. That takes some of the heat out of it. I think the difficulty with engaging with bad faith actors is there's only a very small number of them, but the effect that they have on the overall debate is incredibly poisonous. And actually, there is something to be said for stepping back a bit and putting energies into dealing with people who are really genuinely concerned, because people who are really stoking up the debate, as I said, are not going to change their minds. And I suppose I feel particularly as an elected local representative, if I'm seen to be really kind of furiously turning on someone who seems to be just someone who's a bit worried about the end of their road, it just lends a kind of nasty air to the whole debate. And so actually, for me, I have a finite amount of time and a finite amount of energy, and I would rather spend that time talking to people who actually live within the areas that changes are proposed. and really understanding where they're coming from and where they're traveling to and from, and talking with them about what's available to us and what the alternatives are.
Yeah, yeah. And then if I go on about your approach to dealing with people, I was really interested in the way you described conversations, and so a lot of us obviously have very strong held beliefs and passionate views about this, and you can see some of that in the chat, and actually maybe because of that, with the wrong people to go out and have those conversations, or we need to mellow our approach because we're trying to convince people too readily, and we need to think about our scripts. We've been having a lot of conversations about this in Oxford. Do you think that? Let me ask a more general question about it. Do you think that campaigners can go and have the kind of conversations that you can have as a councillor about kind of how should our streets be, how should they be in the future?
I really do. I really do. And I actually think the more different types of people are having those conversations, the more powerful they are. I think it's a shame when the only people talking about pedestrian safety in Newham are members of Newham cyclists. But it's also a shame when the only people who are talking about LTNs are councillors. I think actually if we can somehow harness the kind of concern that everybody feels about the impact on children's health from air pollution, and combine that with the desire from people who cycle and people who might cycle or who don't currently cycle for protected infrastructure, and combine that with all the other bits of impetus, I think the more varied the conversation is, the less it feels like one person on a soapbox kind of saying, good news, I've come to save you all from yourselves. You need to give up your cars, now follow me.
Yeah, yeah. And I've got that question from Paul in terms of that light challenge. I think it's a question essentially between anecdote and kind of observation and statistics, different approaches to what's the most effective.
I feel like this might be another question there's no answer for. But I think
yes.
I think, again,
maybe you've got to
people,
judge it according to the individual.
Yeah, and judge it, and like I say, leaving space in the conversation I found has always been so useful. Taking a step back and not charging in immediately to say, well, actually, if you look at all the information about this, you'll find that the things that you all think are completely wrong. Like that doesn't help anyone.
Yeah.
Moving from the local to the general, I think, is really helpful. So, it's always helpful for me to point out, well, yeah, like congestion on, say, my local high street is a really big concern. And actually, do you remember when there were those gasworks up just north of here, and all the traffic was backed up for days? And that was actually nothing to do with cycling infrastructure or anything else. It was just about roadworks. And, traffic goes up and down, and perhaps there might be an impact on this. Perhaps we could look at that. But then coming back to, and of course, like I say, the phrase "this is interesting" is a useful one. Then saying, but also, isn't it interesting that actually where this approach has been tried in exactly the same way in other places, the results aren't the kind of worries that people tend to have. People aren't seeing local businesses shutting shop only because people can't park outside. People aren't seeing enormous amounts of congestion on boundary roads. People aren't seeing once it's bedded in, a lot of confusion about different routes and ways to get around. And isn't that interesting? What if we saw the same things here? What would that be like?
Yeah. Okay. And there's an interesting one about house price values. Have you seen any? Have you seen any changes of house prices? I mean, I know there's a more general issue about gentrification, and some places have been accused of gentrifying, and other places I would say, well, that's also known as making places nicer to live in.
Yes,
Do you have a view on that?
I think that's really important. I think it's very hard to take a view on house prices because the housing market in London is so peculiarly overheated and so, weirdly susceptible to different things. That said, the issue that the broader question of gentrification, what that brings me back to really quickly is my firmly held personal belief that we mustn't have systems that have exemption permits for residents. People say that LTNs create boundaries between communities, and I say, well, isn't it interesting that you say that? Because I live just outside an LTN, and actually the LTN, which I'm gesturing off sort of to the west from my desk from me, actually feels more open and more porous to me since it was introduced because the streets are so much safer. I cycle on them a lot more. I walk through them a lot more. I go to use the businesses there. I think that whole argument really falls down if you start offering people residence permits. I think if you take an area, kind of draw an LTN line around it and say everyone inside this can move around however they want, and you lot outside, you have to avoid our area. I think that's really difficult. And I think it is a really common question that people say to me, oh yes, well, I agree with closing that bridge, for example, but obviously the people who live on the road right next to it should have permits to get over it. I think that is the thin end of the wedge and really undermines everything that traffic reduction schemes are trying to do. So I think I would generally be really, really opposed to those.
Right. And Martin's got another question, which is a good one. It's we often see LTNs as a street by street issue, but actually, are they not better summed up by a simple principle, which is that we have main streets for through traffic, and then we have local residential streets, which are for accessing the houses, and then we use that as the principle for describing them, and that's how we organise our streets. And you can explain that to people. You explain whether they drive a car or not.
I think it's a really, really good point. And sometimes when we had some new proposals out for 2 further LTNs, and the reaction to them was, let's just say, very strong. And when I was feeling particularly browbeaten by reactions, which in many cases were from friends and neighbours and people I walk past and people I see all the time, I would just try to think to myself, actually, this is based on a really simple principle, which is that through traffic should go via main roads, and residential streets should be people trying to get to those streets, whether they're visiting or and that's what this really comes down to, and I think trying to hold on to those kind of simple principles can be really, really important.
Yeah. I see Rachel then notes that you then meet the argument that some people do live on the main roads, and you've got the question of whether traffic goes up on those main roads and those people are exposed to more traffic, to which the answer is, of course, we then try and reduce traffic on those roads as well, or at least make sure it's no worse. And
yes, and saying that the LTN and filters are a starting point as well. I always say to people, the planters in the road, obviously we can see those very beautifully illustrated behind you. That is really a starting point for making the roads into the kind of places we want them to be. We then need to move on, and we need, better funding for local government so that the pavements are a better, more level surface for people who have wheelchairs and pushchairs, and we need more cycle storage, and we need more pedestrian crossings, and we need lower speeds, and we need all of these things. But the LTN is the starting point that then allows us to start reclaiming that space and make further changes as well.
Good. Right, I think that's all with the question. Would anyone like to come in with a last minute comment? I think there was a really good journey around. Graham's friend Graham from Oxford has come up with the question. So we have a historic pinch point in Oxford. Okay, I think that's a statement more than a question. Are there other places where that occurs? Yeah, I think that's probably a bit more of a statement. We've been looking for other similar places where we have this pinch point, or whether Oxford's particularly unique in having this. Adam, you have a...
Yeah, one of the things that I saw recently was, I think, was the declaration that LTNs are twice as safe in terms of making roads safer as just 20-mile-per-hour speed limits. And there's almost like an understanding that you put 20-mile-per-hour speed limits in because it makes roads safer for pedestrians and cyclists. But we don't seem to have that sort of narrative. It seems to be lost with the LTNs. And I think, is there a point where you see we get to where an LTN is seen as a road safety intervention, effectively making an area much less likely to have road collisions, etc.? Or is that a narrative that at the moment just isn't possible?
I really hope so. I mean, I really hope more broadly, if, notwithstanding the kind of change in the evidence base I mentioned earlier, that, it's possible. I really hope we could get to a point where the idea of LTNs, as we said earlier, residential streets not used for through traffic, is just the default. And that's what we see in cities where the street design and where the infrastructure allows it to happen. And we are at least broadly comfortable with the idea that doing that improves road safety as well as bringing all the other benefits that we talked about. I think we are a little bit far away from that at the moment, but we have to remain optimistic, otherwise we'd all just go back to bed.
Yeah, and I mean, there is certainly data that LTNs halve the number of road casualties within the area, and I think the boundary roads stay about the same. The 20-mile-an-hour speed limits seem to reduce them about 20%, but that may be a wider area, so it might not be directly comparable. But I can see where that 2-to-1 might have come from. But of course, you could do both. Most LTNs should not be running at 30 miles an hour, I would have thought, if they're residential areas. But I think the road safety, the danger reduction, will be a significantly useful thing to focus on. Graham, was your question a question? You're commenting in the chat.
Robin, the point I'm trying to make is that the network of streets that we have in East Oxford focuses on one bridge with a roundabout. And it's inevitable that the boundary roads will, it seems to me, unless there's dramatic traffic reduction, will inevitably carry much more traffic. And the amount of congestion in East Oxford is witness to that. The only other place I can think of in the world, or in Europe at least, is Ronda in Spain, where one bridge joins two sides of the city. So if the LTNs in Oxford almost inevitably focus on one place and therefore induce significant congestion to make the bus companies very, very upset, then we need a different solution, don't we? LTNs need to be approached in a much broader way than they have been. We should learn a lot more, I think, from the practice in Europe in the 70s and 80s. We mostly don't know what happened in Europe anymore, I guess, I assert, but I don't think the LTNs in Oxford are actually good enough. That wasn't quite a question. That did become a statement.
It was a bit of a statement.
But are there any other solutions?
Yes, a very good question. So, I mean, I think we know in Oxford we are not stopping at LTNs, but we're having traffic filters on the main roads as well. So, and there are a few little gaps between the LTNs to fill in as well. Good. Well, I think I've really found this fascinating as a kind of the communications part around traffic reduction schemes and active travel schemes is crucially important for all of us, I think. And I think Rachel's given us a really good insight. So thank you very much, Rachel, for giving us that point of view, both as a campaigner and a councillor. That was really excellent.
Thank you so much for having me.
You're very welcome. You're welcome to come back at any time. And I will look forward to next week. I cannot remember what we've got next week. I don't know if Adam can tell me. But it will be good. We'll have our normal news, and then we'll have a wonderful presentation from another wonderful person. And thank you all for coming, and have a good week of active travelling around whichever cities and counties you come from. So enjoy your week, and see you next week.